Good evening and welcome to today's briefing at the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Talia Deco. With the surge in attacks against Jews across the globe while Israel embarked on its defensive war against Hamas, and many already say that it had started as early as the massacre itself, it is little surprise to any student of anti-Semitism or the conflict that the two are deeply connected. Serious groups like the institution we host today have taken it upon themselves to see how much these issues correlate. In its latest report, the international technology-based nonprofit organization CyberWrite will show the frightening similarities between those who deny the Holocaust or its magnitude over 7 decades afterwards, and those that deny the atrocities of the most horrific attack against the Jewish people despite its real-time public documentation. With us to discuss the findings and shed light on the extent of and possible solutions for this phenomenon is Tal-Or Cohen Montemayor, founder and executive director of CyberWrite. Tal-Or has a diverse background in academic research, high-tech law, and public policy, and is an expert in digital social platforms, hate speech, and extremism. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening, Tal-Or.
Thank you very much, Talia. Glad to be here.
So Tal-Or, today context is everything, apparently. Can you begin with telling us what exactly you surveyed, where, and for how long before showing us your findings?
Sure, of course. So CyberWrite, as you mentioned, is a ethical tech nonprofit organization. We actually launched the first ever open database of online anti-Semitism, monitoring anti-Semitism across the major social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and X in both English and Arabic back in 2022. As part of the natural outgrowth of launching this first ever open database, we've become trusted partners of many of the social media platforms that we monitor. And what we took on here is what we call a policy gap. So what makes CyberWrite unique versus other nonprofits is not only that we analyze and track anti-Semitism, but we're really looking at it from the lens of digital policy compliance. So examining it from the perspective of the social media platforms themselves, where are their rules failing to be enforced? So when it comes to October 7th denial and distortion, we identified this trend happening online as early as October 8th, right? Already people coming and saying that this massacre never happened, that it didn't happen in this specific way. And what we wanted to do is go ahead and unpack that and see where the social media platforms actually applying their own rules to this discourse of denial and distortion. So we took about 900 examples and we reviewed them and verified roughly 300 of those examples as really promoting discourse of denial and distortion. After analyzing those examples for specific sub-narratives, accounts, hashtags, the way this discourse is being promoted, we of course went ahead and we reported it to the social media platforms. And what we uncovered, unfortunately, is that this specific level of anti-Semitism, this form of anti-Semitism, very new form, is not being actioned by the social media platforms. They are not recognizing it as a form of anti-Semitism and specifically as a form of violent event denial, the same way that they would for, say, Holocaust denial.
Okay, very clear. Maybe I understand you have a presentation for us, so you can show us what your main findings actually were.
Yes, I would love to share the main findings. These are the main findings that you can see on the report and that we'll also make available to everybody via the press kit. So this is going to go into the actual detail of the discourse analysis around this initial data set that I mentioned was roughly 300 examples. How did they play out on social media and what were the primary sub-narratives? So here we have the breakdown that you can see of which platform was contributing to this specific anti-Semitism of October 7th denial and distortion. What you'll notice here is that YouTube is probably the platform with the least amount of representation in the data set. And that is because YouTube actually has the best, most aggressive policy on this issue. Some of you might remember the Sandy Hook shooting from a very long time ago in the United States, the largest school shooting in US history. That event was a watershed moment for YouTube. They had a very famous conspiracy commentator at the time, Alex Jones, who said that the Sandy Hook shooting was a hoax. This caused a tremendous amount of backlash and pushback and actually wrote the books on YouTube's policy on denial of violent events. And we've seen in the data set that we assess here at CyberWell that that's really been effective because they are actually the platform with the least amount of denial and distortion on their platform. So they're applying it also to Holocaust denial and also to October 7th denial. The rest of the data set, and specifically for X, you can see that there is a disproportionate representation, but this really is an issue that's playing out as a newest form of anti-Semitism across all social media platforms. We also show you the breakdown of English content versus Arabic content, and these are two languages that we go into as well in terms of our assessment. Furthermore, I mentioned that we did go ahead and we reported October 7th denial as soon as we had that content and we had verified that it was in fact denying or distorting the October 7th massacres. And these are the rates of removal with an average rate of removal of 8.91%. or total of only 6% of the data set that was removed, with the lowest rate of removal being on X at only 2%, right? And the reason that I'm highlighting X and not YouTube, as I mentioned, is because YouTube actually had a very small data set. Their removal rate was 0%, but it was a very, very small data set. Their actual overall enforcement of the issue of October 7th denial as a violent event is better than other platforms. So really low rates of removal. And just to give a little bit of context, like you said, typically what we see when it comes to reporting online anti-Semitism is that online anti-Semitism is removed only 30% of the time, which in and of itself is very low. But what we see here with October 7th denial and distortion is that it is extremely low. We're identifying a policy gap. Really, the social media platforms simply aren't identifying this as a form of hate speech. And finally, what's alarming, and I mean genuinely alarming, is that even though this is a small and an initial data set that we did a deep dive into to really kind of say, hey, this is the newest form of anti-Semitism, it's being done for the same exact purposes of Holocaust denial to spread anti-Semitism. What's crazy to see here is this small initial data set was viewed a combination of over 25 million times across major social media platforms. So it's not only that the policies aren't being enforced on October 7th denial, it's also the fact that the content itself is gaining a lot of traction on social media platforms. And this is what is so different about October 7th denial versus Holocaust denial. Holocaust denial gained its popularity in kind of fringe circles. October 7th denial is being platformed by mainstream social media platforms. So this is why we are calling the social media platforms to really take a stance on this issue and to start applying their policies at scale when it comes to October 7th denial. And finally, when we say October 7th denial, what do we mean? So these are the primary sub-narratives that we identified in this entire discourse of denial and distorting the October 7th events. The most popular claim far and wide was that there was no rape. This is obviously despite all of the witness testimonies, articles, and testimonies in court that are now coming out about the sexual violence on October 7th. The second one, and this is really the difference between denial versus just getting our facts right. The whole discourse of denial is that actually this entire thing is a manipulation. It's a conspiracy theory that Israel was behind the October 7th massacre. And why was it behind it? It was behind it in order to profit from it in some way, either to gain US aid or to be able to do carte blanche what they wanted to do in Gaza. And that in and of itself, this kind of full circle conspiracy theory is very similar to the way that Holocaust denial as an idea works. It is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. So too is October 7th denial and distortion. So those are our findings, and I'm happy to take additional questions.
Sure, thanks for that disturbing information. I have a question about the platforms themselves. You mainly checked what the anti-Semitic posts were, but do you have any indication if the same platforms are allowing the actual documentation of October 7th in the same way, whether or not they're blocking, incitement or anti-Semitism at the end of the day? Like, is it consistent in the way that they're allowing the spread of information versus disinformation?
Your question is specifically about the massacres themselves, like the footage of the
Yeah,
massacres.
I mean, for example, we know that you didn't present Telegram specifically, but we know that Telegram was used by the Hamas terrorists themselves to upload even real-time a lot of their horrific attacks. So my question is really, if we're looking at how these companies act when things that are considered anti-Semitic or incitement or otherwise are uploaded, were they also censoring these kinds of things, or were they allowing the free flow of information? I'm not sure you have the answer because this isn't your research.
No, it's a fantastic question. It's a fantastic question. And there was a previous Cyberwell report that we released in December that was unpacking the exorbitant rise in not only online anti-Semitism, but graphic content on the social media platforms post October 7th. So post October 7th, in the month following the October 7th massacre, there was an 86% increase in online anti-Semitism across the board. And there was a very unique hijacking of the social media platforms, as you described, by the Hamas organization. They live streamed execution and kidnapping of entire families on their personal accounts. It's something that really became a watershed moment when we think about leveraging social media platforms as a tool of psychological warfare. And then you asked a very legitimate question about what were the policies around this violent and gory material. And this still remains a question for social media platforms, even as additional footage of the carnage, for example, during war itself is coming out. So the answer to your question differentiates by platform. X, it's the wild, wild west. Basically, anything goes there, right? And we saw a lot of the most violent footage unfold directly from hopping to Telegram onto X during the war. Additionally, I will say that most good practice platforms, so Meta and TikTok, also do require by policy that if there is expressed gore, that it comes with expressed condemnation. And actually recently, the Oversight Board, which is kind of this independent quasi-Supreme Court governing body of Meta, made a decision saying that it's not enough that Meta allows for that content to continue to be on the platform, but it needs to be put into recommended content. That means that it's being put into the search engines, into the suggested content, algorithmically enhanced, despite the fact that it's so gory and bloody. And I wrote about this personally. I don't think that that's the right way to do this. Oversight Board said it was connected to human rights concerns, but to be frank with you, the violent effects and the effects of normalizing gore and violence that we've experienced as Israelis and as Jews via the social media platforms is something that I think people are still traumatized by and still dealing with, and not something that we should be suggesting to the algorithms that our teenagers are being exposed to. So yes, the content that is the massacre content is still being allowed up and even recommended, typically as long as there's some kind of condemnation and some kind of trigger warning before that content.
Right, there's really a contradiction here of what we're trying to do. Are we trying to get the truth out, but how do we protect the the mental health of those people who at the end of the day are witnessing it? You mentioned the fact that for post October 7th research, you found that we're talking about relatively normative populations that are being persuaded of the truths of these untruths, as opposed to when we're talking about Holocaust denial. Did you also look at the kind of the backgrounds of these people? Is there any indication, perhaps, which political ideology they might lean, or is it really across the board?
So that's a great question. We saw without any question, we saw that people who were posting content that was anti-Israel content prior to October 7th were much more likely to be posting October 7th distortion and denial, because I think that it's just a confirmation bias. But when we talk about how October 7th denial can spread as a new form of anti-Semitism, that is exactly what we're concerned about, right? So a conspiracy theory plays to people's fears and suspicions. Right now, Israel is embattled in a vicious war, urban warfare, lots of loss of life, very complicated situation. And they're trying to ultimately defend their people and get their hostages out, first of all. But the images are bad. Here comes along a conspiracy theory, massive conspiracy theory, talking about October 7th denial and distortion and how Israel was actually behind this entire event. And they were doing it in order to get something out of it. So it confirms all of these layers of classic anti-Semitism. And why is it believable to normal people? It's believable to normal people because it's playing into a conspiracy theory that's confirming a lot of their fears and suspicions about world power, about the way that money works in the world, the way that military power works in the world. So that's the reason that we're so concerned about this not being identified and removed by the social media platforms at scale. This literally is the platforming of the same exact thing as Holocaust denial, and we need them to take a firm stance and to remove it at scale.
So kind of related to what you were saying, but I want to dig a little deeper. There was a Washington Post article a few days ago, I think, really talking about this specific issue of the deniers and their growth online. And one of the things that they had mentioned was that that a lot of this disinformation is being distributed by regular conspiracy theorists, like the ones who had been warning the public about the dangers of the COVID vaccination. But this, at least when it came to COVID and public health, this did remain on the fringe. How do you explain that this seems to be a little bit more believed than other kinds of conspiracies?
Well, first of all, when it came to COVID, there was very clear government intervention. People were genuinely concerned at the time with COVID misinformation, and by people, I mean governments, were concerned that this pandemic was going to really decimate their infrastructure in terms and their ability to take care of their own people, hospital infrastructure and things like that. There was a lot of genuine effort and campaigning on the parts of government to counteract disinformation that was related to COVID. That is not the case when it comes to October 7th denial and distortion. And it's actually really alarming because we're in the middle of the highest levels of anti-Semitism worldwide right now, not just online, but in schools, in streets, violence against Jewish communities. What CyberWell is saying is, look over here. Here is the latest conspiracy theory that's going to amplify and reinforce this wave of hate. We need to call it for what it is, a form of Jew hatred, and we need to ensure that there is an aggressive calling out of it and presentation of genuine facts on the ground. So I think that it's extremely important. I really do believe that, like you said, the fact that this denial and distortion has gotten into social media, we already see the effects of how quickly it's becoming mainstream. If you stop anybody at a pro-Palestine demonstration, they genuinely believe at least one of the sub-narratives that we've unpacked in this report. And I think there's also another thing to be said here, not only about social media, but about the integrity of our mainstream news sources. Some of the misinformation and disinformation that we saw tweeted and shared on social media post-October 7th was coming from Al Jazeera, which has influences on millions and millions of people in the Middle East and in the West. They literally tweeted with very little consequence that the Israeli infants that were incinerated and beheaded was a generated AI image, and nothing happened to them, and they're still considered a legitimate news source. And that changes the way that people are looking not only at Israel, but also at Jews. They believe this entire war is a lie. And in fact, they may use that as a reason to exact their ire on Jewish communities. It's very concerning.
It is very concerning. And of course, as members of the profession, we all have to be very, very careful about what we put out and understand the responsibilities that we have, especially at a time like this. So essentially what you're saying is these governments need to understand that this is not just a Jewish problem, or an Israeli problem, but it's a public problem. It's a problem that ends up spilling over in the streets of the United States or otherwise. We saw it obviously in demonstrations that even became lethal in some cities. Very interesting. One journalist is asking about what you had referred to earlier on in terms of the the actual campaigns by Hamas or maybe even Iran to create misinformation and disinformation online. Do you have any information on that? Are you seeing a difference in terms of the Arabic media versus the English language media on that end?
That's a great question. So actually, some of the most aggressive and well-produced misinformation and disinformation content pieces in this campaign were produced in English, okay? Very much on purpose. The report itself goes into an unpacking of a specific network of accounts that are sharing, retweeting, and mentioning and amplifying the discourse around denial and distortion of October 7th on Twitter specifically. And the other thing that I want to highlight is, again, the issue of disproportionate exposure. We mentioned small data set viewed over 25 million times. On X specifically, we saw accounts with only thousands of followers, 6,000 followers, 3,000 followers, some of them based in the Middle East, tweeting in English and getting 3 million views on denial and distortion content. So there are elements here of exposure. There are elements here like what I just presented to you guys here about this element of an account with only thousands of followers getting 3 million views. What does that tell us? That tells us that there could be inauthentic bot activity in terms of amplifying, viewing, and tweeting this specific piece of content. I encourage you guys to read the report to see more about the network information. Good question.
So of course we'll share the report with everybody online and with those who had asked for the recording and couldn't attend. I think the last question really should connect us to International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which we're marking this Saturday. Are you worried that despite your findings that the post-October 7th deniers are more out in the open compared to the Holocaust deniers, which were really more on the fringe? Could this produce a ripple effect and cause more people to become even more susceptible to these myth-truths about the Holocaust itself?
Absolutely, without question. We also see a lot of Holocaust appropriation happening right now online on the side of the Palestinian side, comparing Gaza to a concentration camp, comparing Israel to Nazis, saying that the victims became the perpetrators. I mean, this has been in the online anti-Semitic discourse for years coming, and I would say it's probably reaching new heights now. So between October 7th denial and Holocaust distortion, and October 7th distortion, Holocaust appropriation on the Palestinian side, and comparing Israel to Nazis, which, by the way, is a form of anti-Semitism according to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. So it is Jew hatred, will absolutely make people susceptible to the concept of Holocaust revisionism, and moreover, inspire more anti-Semitism. And that really is what I'm deeply concerned about, not only from a social media perspective, but in general. You know, we recently had the release of the Biden-Harris administration White House strategy on anti-Semitism. I think that this is the road test for, is that actually going to be an effective strategy? And it needs to be implemented. And this is really part of it. Even as we get further and further away from the Holocaust, we're also in a situation where our survivors are dying out. We have less living testimony of survivors. And the youngest generation, which is looking at social media platforms as a primary news source, anywhere between 40 to 50 hours a week, are less and less likely to know that the Holocaust happened. So this is another nail in that coffin unless we do something about it.
Very clear. I'll just ask one follow-up question. In addition to working with or approaching the companies themselves, have you also been lobbying governments to show them your research and findings, or are you mainly focused on the social networks?
Yeah, our primary mission is to drive the enforcement and improvement of digital policies on social media. But certainly when we think about working with governments who need transparency about the issue of what is the state of online anti-Semitism, we do share our data with governments as well, be that the US government, Israeli government, and the European Union, as they look to enforce the Digital Services Act, which is the most aggressive piece of legislation that can hold social media platforms accountable for illegal hate speech. We do not receive any government funding. It's important for me to say all of our research is our own research, and we are supported entirely by donations.
And do you have plans for a next study, what your area of focus will be, or are you still trying to figure out what to do with this one?
Well, this is definitely an issue that we're going to continue to monitor throughout the year, and I'm actually confident that we'll be able to get movement with some of our partners, because it just does fall directly in line with the violent events policy. It just needs to be recognized as such and needs to be treated as what it is, which is Holocaust denial. And for the next part of our study, we're going to be looking at how advertiser funds monetize online anti-Semitism. So be on the lookout for that report. It will be a big one.
I can imagine. Tal-Or Cohen Montemayor, founder and executive director of CyberWrite. Thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to hearing your next research results.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.